All right. Are you all ready? Should I begin?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
Good. Students, I request you all to please turn on your cameras and keep your cameras on during the whole time. Maida, please do not do the attendance of those students whose cameras are off. And today, well, I need your full attention. I told you earlier that propaganda model is a little bit trickier to understand. So I will be asking you questions like uh, like in the middle of my lecture, I will stop and ask randomly anyone to summarize the information that I would have explained. All right. So please be very attentive. All right. In our last class, we actually spent a considerable amount of time discussing the word propaganda, and we discussed what is the meaning of propaganda, what it is actually, and I briefly talked about its different types, and then with that, I also asked you a question, uh, which is written right here, that can media be used as a propaganda tool? So I asked you that, do you think that media can be used as a propaganda tool? And almost all of you gave your answer in affirmation. You said that yes, media can be used as a propaganda tool, sometimes by journalists, editors, publishers, sometimes even by governments, agencies, foreign media, and there are much more examples that we can give, that how media can use propaganda as a tool. Let's proceed to our next slide. Our speed will be little slower for this model, particularly because I really want all of you to understand this. Excuse me. All right, now let's talk about what propaganda model is. I think it is very, very important for me to explain its background in the beginning. Um, there are some people in the waiting room. Let me admit them, and then, all right. Now, please pay attention to what I say, and then we will read the content that you see on the slide together. Okay. Now, just pay attention to my words here, like I said, and then we will read the content here together to make sense of what we have here. Propaganda model. Uh, Propaganda model was actually presented in our previous lecture. We learned what is propaganda. However, from today, we are going to learn propaganda model. This is the model which was presented by two American scholars. They co-authored a book which came out in 1988. And we will talk about the title of the book shortly. Just to tell you briefly, the title of the book was Manufacturing Consent and the Political Economy of Mass Media. With that, the names of those two scholars, two American scholars, were Edward S. Herman and Noam Chomsky. Now, let me tell you that the book was written by American scholars who were obviously studying American media. They were studying American government, American issues, American political examples. For this reason, the model which was presented by Herman and Chomsky, that is related to American context, that presents the examples of America, and that discusses America a lot. However, the model can be applicable to other societies as well, including Pakistan. Now, being scholars and being students of mass media, it is our job to learn whether parts of this model are applicable to our situation, or all of the model is applicable to our situation, or maybe only the whole model maybe is not applicable at all for Pakistani situation. This is us who determine through our discussion, through our debate, through our studies, research, and everything. Now, Herman and Chomsky, when they proposed this model, give me a minute here, I'll be back soon. Excuse me. Gee, I'm sorry I went to get myself a glass of water. My throat was getting very dry. I had been speaking a lot in my previous class and then now this class. So I wanted some water. All right. So I was saying that do not for now, just pay attention to my words and together we'll read the content afterwards to make sense of what we have here. I was saying that Herman and Chomsky, the writers of the book in which they propose propaganda model, they 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 examined American media. So their examples come from American media, and you will notice that the model was presented in American context. However, uh, the model can also be applicable to other societies, including Pakistan. And being scholars, this is our job to determine whether the whole model is applicable, or parts of it are applicable, or it is possible that like the model is not applicable at all on Pakistani context. Now, in their model, the idea that they proposed was that apparently it is assumed that societies uh, that are democratically stable or politically stable, there is no propaganda happening. Propaganda usually happens in countries where democracy is not stable, where political system is not stable. The country is developing, it is not developed yet. For example, Pakistan. Take the example of Pakistan here. Now, Pakistan is a country that has been pretty unstable politically, and democracy is also weak. Although we have not seen any military coup in past few years, however, in history, when we look at the history of our country, we'll notice that historically our country has mostly been ruled by the military establishment. We have had military governments, of course, which is not democracy. So democracy is weak here. In military governments, you see propaganda. Yeah, propaganda is easily noticeable because military government cannot let all the information to be broadcast. You may have heard stories from your parents or from your teachers in other courses of mass comm that in the time period of General Zia, who was Pakistan's military dictator, the media was not free. Media would always sing songs of Zia government. Media would always publicize content which would favor the rule of the Zia government, and media. Uh, I mean, General Zia's period is known as the dark period of journalism in Pakistan because many journalists were imprisoned, including Faiz Ahmad Faiz, Habib Jalal. Faiz Ahmad Faiz is known as an Urdu poet, but he was a journalist too. Same was the case with Habib Jalib, and intellectuals were imprisoned. Habib Jalib was imprisoned, and then Faiz Ahmad Faiz went into exile, and then he spent much of his life in exile. You see, people were not free to say. There was not freedom of speech. People were not free to say what they wanted to say. uh, Now easily propaganda is noticeable in such a society. However, it is assumed that in a country like United States, which is apparently politically developed, US has not seen any military dictator or any military government, and it is assumed that propaganda maybe does not happen in the US. But Herman and Chomsky argued that this assumption is incorrect. Although people assume There is no propaganda in United States. However, propaganda does happen, but it is hard to notice. Now let's read the content that we see here. Propaganda is easier to observe in politically unstable societies. This is the same thing that I just said, that Pakistan has been politically unstable. And whenever Pakistan is politically unstable, it is very easy to observe propaganda. Even when General Musharraf's coup happened, when he took over and he overthrew the government of Nawaz Sharif, if maybe some of you remember, or you may have heard from your parents, that the first thing that happened was the blackout on media. Media completely went silent and black. There was complete, whenever you would you turn on your TV, nothing. So that is, of course, whenever the information is being censored, whenever there is whenever information is being restricted, of course that is propaganda. So they say that propaganda is easier to observe in politically unstable societies. However, in democratic societies like the US, propaganda is hard to be noticed or identified. This is the main crux of this propaganda model. They begin by saying that it is assumed propaganda exists only in societies that are politically unstable. I will give you another example. I will give you the example of uh, Saudi Arabia. We know that they have a monarchy, and we know that Saudi Arabia does not have democracy. And so the content that comes through media, that is sanctioned by the government, which means the media cannot publish, broadcast, or show anything which is not approved by the government. In order to publish anything, to broadcast anything, to show anything, the content should have approval of the Saudi government. So propaganda is easy to observe here. However, we may say that in Western countries that are economically powerful, politically powerful, industrially powerful, it is said that while people enjoy freedom, and in media too enjoys freedom. And it can be said that while media does not face any sort of criticism, censorship, or any restriction, media is free. So no propaganda is happening. Journalists are free to say what they want, but the situation is quite the contrary. This is not to say that US does not have propaganda. They do have propaganda. However, Herman and Chomsky argue that this sort of propaganda is very hard to be noticed and hard to be identified. Now I'll stop here to take your questions and also to assess your understanding, to make sure that what I have said and what I have been explaining, you actually have understood it very well. So let's ask Basim Dar. Ji Basim, I request you to please quickly summarize what I have just said. Basim Dar, can you listen to me? Can you hear me, Basim? All right, seems like this person is maybe not, apparently he is in the meeting room, but he's not with us, so I'm going to remove him. All right, let's ask Fatmeen. Fatmeen, better your camera is off. Can you please quickly summarize what I just said? Fatmeen Shahid. Fatmeen, can you hear me? All right, I'm removing Fatmeen as well. Okay, let me ask now Umair Arif. Umair, can you hear me? Can you quickly
Yes, ma'am.
can you quickly summarize what I just said? I just noticed that you rejoined. Maybe you did you miss any part of my explanation of this slide, or did you hear it?
Yes, ma'am. Yes,
जी
ma'am. मैंने अभी ज्वाइन किया है.
अच्छा चलें ठीक है. Let's then ask Usman Rizvi, Sayyid Muhammad Usman Rizvi. जी Usman, can you quickly summarize what I just said?
Yes, ma'am.
जी.
मैम आपने ये बताया जो पॉलिटिकली अनस्टेबल कंट्रीज होती हैं वहाँ पे प्रोपेगेंडा इजीली हो जाए, इजीली एक्सेप्ट कर लेते हैं लोग कोई भी प्रोपेगेंडा को.
ठीक है. शाबाश. Let's ask.
और ये
Let's ask. Wait a minute. Hadi, beta, do you have a question?
Yes, ma'am.
जी जी. Go ahead.
And your second point है कि however in democratic societies like in the US, propaganda is hard to be noticed or identified. लेकिन मैं पूछना ये था कि देखें डेमोक्रेसी जहाँ पर आती है वहाँ पर बंदे के पास उसको ऑन पेपर चाहे कहें लेकिन फ्रीडम ऑफ स्पीच होती है और फ्रीडम ऑफ स्पीच जिसके पास होती है देन वो मिस इन्फॉर्मेशन भी क्रिएट कर सकते हैं क्योंकि परसेप्शंस पीपल हैव डिफरेंट परसेप्शंस एंड इंटेंशंस. The conspiracy theorists are a classic example of freedom of speech.
Yes.
तो ये पॉइंट थोड़ा सा वो नहीं हो जाएगा क्योंकि वहां पर तो बंदा कुछ भी चाहे बोल सकता है ना. यहाँ पर तो फ्रीडम ऑफ स्पीच नहीं है जो नॉन डेमोक्रेटिक कंट्रीज हैं.
So you want to say that there is no propaganda, like people, since people are free to say what they want, so they can have a debate.
No, I'm not saying that. I'm saying that there's written a propaganda is hard to notice.
Yes.
Isn't that propaganda would be much easier to notice where there is freedom of speech and conspiracy theories, misinformation?
Oh, okay.
Because,
well, see, propaganda. We are talking about propaganda by media. When here we are referring to propaganda by media. It is assumed and it is said that media is not involved in any propaganda. You see, in a country, for example, in Pakistan, during the Zia government, media became the mouth organ of government. By mouth organ, I mean media will say whatever government wants media to say. In that situation, we know that this is propaganda. Media is speaking what government is, well, media is mouth organ. Media is saying the same thing that the government is saying. In this example, it is very easily noticeable. Propaganda is easily noticeable. Apparently, in a society where democracy is established, well, people are free, media is free, media is enjoying freedom. Nobody is forcing media to publish anything, to broadcast anything. I'll give you another example from American media just to make it further clear. Let's say that American media keeps saying, keeps doing propaganda against Russians, against communism. Now we know that this is coming. Well, this may be something coming from the government. Because this is something related to the government's agenda. People apparently may think, well, media does not have any pressure to broadcast any information. Media is free. But this is not the case. Herman and Chomsky are saying that the situation is different. Propaganda does exist, but it is hard to be noticed. If that answers your question. I just noticed that Misha also raised her hand. Yes, Misha, do you have a question?
The last point that you made, I was going to ask almost the same thing, that despite the fact that it doesn't really appear prominently on the countries of developed medias of developed countries, that there is any propaganda going on, but on the other hand, there are some kind of disguised authorities or powers that actually control even the media. So, and a lot of people, or majorly people, know about it. So, how come people do not believe or realize that there is a lot of propaganda shown on American media as well?
Yes, it's a very good question. Now, in this model, Herman and Chomsky are going to take us to systematic filters. Step by step, they will show us that these are the filters that control the information that comes to us. When to respond to Misha's question, she said that how come people don't realize that propaganda is happening? The content and the information that comes from media, that is not specifically for mass comm students, for media studies students. That is for masses, for everyone, for people who are studying medicine, people who are studying architecture, people who are studying agriculture, people who are studying, let's say, business, law, anything. They do not have disciplinary training in the field of media studies. Maybe being students of media studies and being scholars of media studies, we have somewhat different style of looking at the content. But if you pay attention to your family members, if I look at my father, my mother, my siblings, my my or even anyone in my in-laws, yes, it is generally the people generally have this perception that, well, media sometimes gives you false information, but to a large extent they believe in the information that is given by media. And same is the case, of course, in United States. So whatever media shows to them, people tend to believe upon it. People, I mean, there was a time, I encourage you to study what happened in Vietnam War. I encourage you to study what happened during even war on terror. I mean, people, and even when there was this issue of that, this accusation on Iraq that Iraq has these weapons of mass destruction. Later, I mean, of course, this accusation was proved false. Many people, scholars like Chomsky and Herman, the scholars who have presented this model, they were arguing that war is not the important issue right now. America, the country, is currently facing for many other important issues that need to be addressed. However, since war was the agenda of the government, that ultimately became the agenda of public as well, which means through propaganda, the governments have the power to gear up public to think in a particular way, or to steer the direction of their thoughts. Uh, does this answer your question, Misha?
Ma'am, manipulation automatically becomes easy when you have the power.
Mahnur, I don't understand. Can you please say it again?
Welcome, okay, ma'am. Just like that, government has the power to manipulate people. Not आम लोग इतने easily नहीं manipulate propagandas कर सकते जैसे media has a power, government has a power. मैंने उन question का आगे से जैसे ही अपनी opinion दिया.
For some reason, your voice is not clear, but I have understood only bits of what you said. So I think you are saying that media has the power to exercise propaganda and government can
Yes,
also.
ma'am.
Is this what you are saying?
Yes, ma'am.
Misha, Hadi, I'm not sure if you have understood what I said, but I am sure in the preceding slides, this will further clarity. My internet was playing up today, and for that reason, I am doing this class using my cellular phone data, and it's again not very strong. So I apologize if there is any problem in my voice, or uh, uh, if you face any difficulty. Can I move to my next slide?
Yes.
Yes, ma'am.
Do you have any
Yes,
understanding
ma'am.
thus far? All right. Let's move to the next slide now. So this is the same information that I just said. I described in my last slide. Propaganda model was proposed by two scholars. Here I have mentioned only their last names. Herman, his first name was Edward S. Herman. And Chomsky's first name is Noam Chomsky. How many of you, by the way, are familiar with Noam Chomsky? He's a famous American scholar and a political.
Yes, ma'am.
Temur, are you familiar? Yes.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Anyone else? Anyone else?
मैंने भी देखी है उसकी उनकी बुक्स.
Who was speaking?
मैम मोहम्मद अरबाज खान.
Arbaz Khan. Thank you. Yes. So Noam Chomsky is a famous American scholar. He is Jewish, but in his writings, he writes against Jewish advancements in Palestine. Similarly, he is an American. However, in his writings, he writes against American political and military advancements. He is a very strong critical voice in United States. Anyways, so the model was presented by Edward S. Herman and Noam Chomsky. And like I said, the model was presented in 1988. Actually, in 1988, Herman and Chomsky, they co-authored a book, and the book's title was, I have just highlighted the title of the book, and you may also notice that um, I have italicized the title of the book to let it stand out. The title of the book was Manufacturing Consent, the Political Economy of Mass Media. Now, I'll stop here to ask you again, what is the meaning of, let's talk about the word consent first. What is the meaning of the word consent?
And mutual understanding.
Good, very good. Anyone else? What is
To
मैम
consent?
किसी की
agree
इजाजत
to
लेना.
something. To agree to do something.
Anu, to agree to do something. Yes. Anyone else? Good job, Manur and Misha. The meaning of consent basically means agreement. Let's say if someone asks me that, let's go for a morning walk at 6 in the morning tomorrow. And if I agree to that, which means I am giving my consent. If someone says, well, let's eat our lunch today at 1 in the afternoon instead of eating it at 2 or 3 in the afternoon, so do you give your consent for that? Which means the person is seeking my agreement, that do you agree to this or not. Consent basically means agreement. In Urdu we use a word razamandi. Razamandi is agreement, that you are giving your razamandi. I think razamandi is the word that explains it really, really well. Consent. This is consent. Now, what is manufacturing? Manufacturing is to produce something. Manufacturers of electronic appliances, manufacturers of, so you consume milk in your everyday life to make chai or to drink. So there is a company that manufactures, that processes that milk, and then uh, they prepare it in a Tetra Pak. They do the packing in a Tetra Pak form. So they are manufacturers. Similarly, the manufacturers of toothpaste, manufacturers of detergents, laundry detergents, dishwashing detergents, and so many things. Manufacturers of fabric, manufacturers of shoes. So manufacturers are actually producers. This is the idea behind manufacturers. Now, manufacturing consent, people who are manufacturers of what? Manufacturers of consent. They actually manufacture your consent. I just gave the example of war on terror. Maybe, I mean, war on terror was actually a sort of war where the US engaged in war against Afghanistan first and then Iraq. So, and to wage war on a country, especially on another country, the government of that country needs the consent of its people. Uh, if you remember, when 9/11 happened, soon after that, the US waged war on terror, and they waged a war in Afghanistan. And George W. Bush Jr. was a US president at that time. And in his historic speech, and the speech later became very popular. In his speech, he said, "Are you with us or them?" If you remember. So which means he was asking his people that are you going to support us in the war? And this is actually a way of manufacturing consent. You are, and at that time I remember Chomsky was highly critical of that war, especially the war on terror, and so were many people in American academia. By the way, Noam Chomsky is a person from academia. He taught at MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, for nearly half a century. And nowadays he is teaching at the University of Arizona. He is an American scholar and an American academic of finest quality. And he has produced really, really remarkable works, writings, essays, books. So Chomsky, he was he wrote about manufacturing consent at that time as well, and he was of the view that war is not important right now. There are many other issues that America is facing. Of course, he was talking about America. He's an American. He said that many other important issues are there that need to be addressed instead of doing a war, waging a war. Why are we spending our money on a war, and that kind of thing. So you see, this is the whole concept of manufacturing consent, that how media tends to manufacture consent through propaganda. And of course, this is done at the behest of government, at the behest of advertisers, at the behest of establishment and all that. And we'll learn more about it. Now, I only wanted to explain the concept of manufacturing consent. Is this clear to everyone? Do you all know what is the meaning of manufacturing consent?
Yes,
Yes,
ma'am.
ma'am.
All right.
Yes, ma'am.
Let's talk about just this first bullet here. It says that propaganda model traces the routes by which money and power are able to filter out the news fit to print, marginalize dissent, and allow government and dominant private interests to get their messages across the public. Let me explain this. Now, they are saying that in propaganda model, they are tracing, Herman and Chomsky are tracing that how money and power, people who are in power, for example, government, there are, whoever is part of government, whoever is in the government, they have power. So people who have power or people who have money, for example, advertisers, for example, multinational corporation owners, for example, media owners, they have money. So how they are able to filter out information which is fit to print, information which will be published. Now, marginalized dissent. Let's talk about dissent. What is dissent? Dissent, the meaning of dissent is different, being different. Uh, Dissidents are usually the journalists who give a different opinion, who are very vocal and bold against government. Uh, how many of you are familiar with the journalist, with the Saudi journalist name? His name was Jamal Khashoggi. How many of you are familiar with his name?
I'm the one who was killed.
Yes, yes, exactly. Arbaz knows him. Anyone else? Jamal Khashoggi.
Yes, ma'am.
Usman Rizvi also knows him. Anyone else? Ahmad Altaf. Have you ever heard about Jamal Khashoggi? He was in news, by the
No,
way.
ma'am.
He was in news. I recommend that you search him up, Jamal Khashoggi. Misha, Hadi, uh, Mahnoor,
Yes, ma'am.
Maida, Rohma, Ramsa.
Yes, ma'am.
Are you familiar with Jamal Khashoggi? Kamal Zareen, Maliha. All right.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, very good. Jamal Khashoggi was actually, he's known as a Saudi dissident. Dissident means again a person who has a different opinion. He was a Saudi citizen, uh, a citizen of Saudi Arabia. However, he was residing in the United States. And he used to write with the Washington Post, which is a famous American newspaper and that has national level circulation. So Jamal Khashoggi was, let's say, a columnist at at the Washington Post. He was killed in the Saudi consulate in Turkey, in Istanbul, Turkey. And it is said that his body was dismembered while he was still alive, and later pieces of his dismembered body were packed up and were taken to Saudi Arabia. He was a dissident. Here I was giving you his example because I wanted to explain and let you understand what is a dissident. Why was he dissident? Because Jamal Khashoggi, in his writings, he wrote against Saudi government. He wrote against Saudi monarchy. He wrote against, like he was a different voice. You know, in Saudi Arabia, media is controlled. I have already talked about this. However, in a foreign media, Jamal Khashoggi was a very vocal, popular, solid, bold sound who was criticizing the Saudi government's policies. He was a dissident. And same is the case with Noam Chomsky. Noam Chomsky is also considered as a dissident who has a different opinion. Misha, you raised your hand.
Yes, ma'am. If Saudi media didn't allow him to speak anything that is against their government, then and he uses use the foreign media platform, then how did they actually, kind of bother what he used to say on some foreign media? And
Because yes, he was living outside his country and he was using the platform of foreign media because he was not allowed to publish within his country. But Saudi government felt him as a threat. He was a strong voice. The Washington Post is a famous newspaper. It is an international newspaper, a newspaper that has its reach not only in the US but across the globe, in the whole world. And the Saudi government felt him a threat because, in a way, or maybe in their eyes, he was mobilizing international community. When you are writing in an international newspaper and you are letting the world know, see what this is what is happening in a country that leads the Muslim world. So don't you think that he was kind of creating, mobilizing international community uh, against a powerful government? So he was a dissident, and of course they conceived him as a threat. Well, what they did, what we heard that what Saudi government did was of absolutely brutal, of course, and they did this because maybe they didn't do this. This is my assumption, and it may be wrong. Maybe they did this because they didn't see him as a threat, but they felt offended. They felt offended, and then they thought, all right, well, this man, let's punish him. Hadi, you have a question? Bache, I have run out of time. I have less than a minute. So you can ask me question. If we run out of time,